We use apps every day, right? But we don't always think about all the crazy complicated stuff happening behind the scenes. Like, it's kind of like enjoying a nice house, but never even considering the plumbing until something goes wrong. And then you're like, whoa, there's a whole hidden world under here. So today we are doing a deep dive into API testing, which most people haven't even heard of. But it's super important to make sure all that behind the scenes stuff in our apps is running smoothly. Like with plumbing, you don't want any leaks, right? You've been working with some pretty technical material on this lately, haven't you? So we're going to try to break it all down and figure out what you really need to know.
Yeah, for sure. I think API testing is one of those things that can be easy to overlook, but it's absolutely essential, especially now with everyone building systems with all these tiny microservices. It's really the glue that holds everything together.
Okay, so first things first. Just in case someone out there is like me, not a developer. What exactly is an API? Like, what's a good way to explain it to someone who doesn't write code all day?
Okay. Imagine you're ordering food online. You're using an app, scrolling through the menu, picking what you want. You could even track the delivery, see where the driver is. But your app isn't doing all that by itself, right? It's talking to the restaurant system in the background. An API is like the messenger that lets those two systems communicate. Exchange information without you even knowing it's happening.
Okay, so it's like a constant conversation going on that we just never see.
Precisely.
That makes me think of this time I was using a ride-sharing app, and I was trying to confirm my pickup location, but it just kept giving me an error message no matter what I did. From an API testing perspective, what kinds of things could have been going wrong there?
Oh, man. So many possibilities. It could be a problem with the endpoint. That's kind of like the address the message is being sent to. Or maybe the data isn't formatted the right way. Like, imagine the app is sending a message in one language, but the ride-sharing system only understands a different one.
Oh, so like a lost in translation kind of thing.
Exactly. Or it could be something with the status codes and how they handle errors. Let's say the ride-sharing system is down for maintenance. The API needs to communicate that back to the app very clearly, so it can display a nice, helpful message instead of just crashing.
Right. That makes sense. So API testing isn't just about finding bugs then. It's about making sure the whole system is super robust and giving the user a good experience.
Absolutely. And especially when we're talking about microservices, where you have all these little services talking to each other through APIs.
It gets even more important, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Because if one service fails, it can cascade and affect the whole system.
Oh, wow. Okay, so now I want to talk about the tools, the actual stuff people use to do this testing. Your material mentions two specifically, Postman and RestAssured. They seem to represent two different approaches, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, you could put it that way. So Postman is known for being very user-friendly. It has a visual interface. You can click around, create requests, add assertions, even run some automated tests. It's a great starting point for a lot of people. Like, think of it as your API Swiss Army knife.
Okay, I like that. And what about RestAssured?
RestAssured is a bit different. It's a Java-based library, so it's all about code. For developers who are comfortable with that, it gives them a ton of power and flexibility.
So less clicking through menus, more writing the tests themselves.
Exactly. They both have their strengths, for sure. Like, Postman is awesome if you're new to API testing, or if your team prefers a more visual way of working. But RestAssured is really powerful for those complex scenarios, and for teams who are already deep in the Java world.
I see. Okay, so to illustrate the difference, let's use the example from your research, testing a login endpoint. First, how would you tackle this in Postman?
All right, so in Postman, you would visually create a POC request to the login endpoint. You'd put in the username and password. Then you'd add some assertions. These are basically checks to see if the response is what you expect, like a status code of 200 and a message confirming the login was successful.
Gotcha. So that's pretty straightforward, it sounds like. What about in RestAssured?
In RestAssured, you'd be writing Java code to do the same thing. You'd define the request, specify the endpoint, the method, any headers, and then the request body, which includes the username and password. Then you'd use RestAssured's built-in methods to validate the response. Make sure it's a successful login.
Okay, so that definitely sounds more technical, like you need to understand coding and how APIs work on a deeper level.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to give you a taste of what that looks like, here's a tiny snippet of the code you might write. Given, content type application, JSON, body, and then the username and password in JSON format. When, POST, and then the URL of the login endpoint. Then, status code 200, body, message equal to login successful.
Okay, wow. So that's a lot different than clicking buttons in Postman. But you're right, it does seem like it would offer way more control.
Exactly. And this is just a super basic example, too. You can build much more sophisticated tests with RestAssured to cover all sorts of crazy scenarios.
I can only imagine. So basically, choosing between Postman and RestAssured comes down to your comfort level with coding and how complex the tests need to be.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
It's like picking the right tool for the job, as they say. Speaking of jobs, you mentioned earlier that API testing shouldn't be an afterthought, right? So how do we integrate it into the entire development process? Like, we don't want to wait till the house is built to realize the pipes are leaking.
Exactly. Yeah, that's where continuous integration and continuous delivery comes in CI/CD for short. Basically, it's a system that automatically runs your tests every time you make changes to the code. So it's like having this robot plumber constantly inspecting your pipes for leaks.
Oh, I like that analogy. So you catch problems super early on and keep everything running smoothly.
Exactly. It's all about making quality assurance a core part of the development process, not something you tack on at the end. And both Postman and RestAssured can fit into these CI/CD pipelines.
That's good to know. Okay, so let's say I'm setting up API tests for the first time. What are some best practices, like things I should definitely keep in mind?
All right, so one of the most important things is to use environment variables. Remember how we were talking about endpoints, like the specific addresses for different parts of the system? Well, those addresses might change depending on where you're testing.
Oh, right. Like, are you on a development server, a staging server, or the live production environment?
Exactly, and you don't want to hard code those addresses into every single test. That would be a nightmare to change later. So instead you use a variable.
A variable that you can easily swap out.
Yep. It's like having labeled valves for your plumbing system.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. What about when you're actually validating the responses from the API? What should I be looking at there?
Well, don't just focus on the status codes. Like the 200s and 400s that tell you if the request succeeded or failed. You got to dig deeper into the response itself.
Oh, so like what else?
Look at the response times. Make sure things are happening quickly enough. Check the headers for any important information, like authentication tokens.
Ah, right.
And then really scrutinize the content of the response body.
To make sure the data is what you expect.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's like being a detective, examining all the evidence.
I like that. Got to put on your detective hat.
And just like a detective, you need to be ready for different scenarios. So when it comes to authentication, if you're dealing with secured APIs, you need to make sure your tests can handle that properly.
Right, so if the API requires a login or something.
Yeah, you might need to automate token generation. Or use pre-configured tokens so your tests have the right credentials.
Cool.
It's like making sure they have a key to get through the door.
Makes sense.
What else?
Oh, here's another pro tip. Make your test data-driven.
Data-driven. So that means running the same test with different sets of input data.
Ah, to cover a wider range of scenarios.
Exactly. You can use variables or even external data files to do this.
So it's like testing your plumbing system with different water pressures, different temperatures.
Yeah, to make sure it can handle anything you throw at it.
Okay, that's smart.
And finally, don't underestimate the importance of logging and reporting.
Logging and reporting.
Yeah, make sure your tests generate detailed logs.
And summaries of what happened.
Exactly, because when something goes wrong, you need to be able to figure out why.
Right, so it's like having a record of what happened.
Precisely. Comprehensive logs are super valuable for troubleshooting. Think of them like blueprints that help you understand the flow of data.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about what APIs are, why testing them is so important. We looked at different tools like Postman and RestAssured. And now we've even gotten into some best practices for setting up effective tests. It's clear that API testing, even though it's behind the scenes, it's a really big deal for building good software.
Yeah, it really is. Like, imagine building a house. You might only see the finished exterior, but the foundation has to be solid.
Right, exactly.
But speaking of foundations, there's another crucial aspect of API testing we haven't touched on yet.
Oh, and what's that?
Security testing.
Security testing. Oh, that sounds important. It's like, making sure all the doors and windows are locked so no one can just sneak into your house.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to think about it. So, with API security testing, we're trying to find any vulnerabilities that hackers could exploit.
Vulnerabilities.
Yeah, like weaknesses in the code, things that could let someone bypass security measures, gain unauthorized access to data, that sort of thing.
So, like, what are some examples?
Well, you've got things like SQL injection attacks. where someone tries to insert malicious code into your database.
Yeah.
Or broken authentication, where they can bypass your login system completely.
Oh, wow. That's scary.
Yeah, it can get pretty serious.
So it's not just about making sure the API works right. It's also about making sure it's protected.
Exactly. API security testing is a whole specialty in itself. But there are some key areas to focus on, like your authentication mechanisms need to be rock solid, make sure your API endpoints are properly authorized, and of course you got to handle sensitive data very carefully.
Sensitive data, like what?
Passwords, credit card numbers, that sort of thing. You don't want that stuff falling into the wrong hands.
Absolutely not. So it sounds like security testing is like having that alarm system installed, to protect your house from intruders.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And just like a home security system, your API security testing has to be thorough. And you got to keep it updated because the threats are always changing.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to think about. So you've covered functional testing, performance testing, and now security testing too. All these layers working together to make sure our APIs are top-notch.
Yep. And as we rely more and more on APIs, the need for people who know how to test them is just going to keep growing.
I bet. It sounds like a pretty fascinating field, actually. Lots of opportunities to learn and specialize.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so if our listener is taking away one thing from all this deep diving into API testing, what would it be?
That's a good question. I think the key takeaway is this. API testing isn't just some boring technical thing. It's really about creating high-quality software that people can trust. Whether you're using a tool like Postman or a more code-driven approach like RestAssured, the goal is the same. Making sure your APIs are reliable, secure, and they do what they're supposed to do.
It makes sense. And don't be afraid to experiment, right? Learn as you go, try different things.
Oh, for sure. The more you understand about APIs and how to test them, the better you'll be at building amazing software.
Right. Right. And this whole world of software development is always changing too.
It is. It's constantly evolving.
So you got to stay curious, keep learning new stuff.
Absolutely.
All right. Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listener with something to think about. We've been talking about testing individual APIs, but these days, systems are getting so complex.
Oh, yeah.
What about the interactions between APIs? How do we make sure all those pieces are working together smoothly?
That's a great question. As we move more towards these interconnected systems, microservices, testing those interactions becomes super critical. It's like making sure all the different systems within a city work together. Transportation, communication, utilities, everything has to be in sync.
Wow, that's a great point.
We're talking about integration testing, end-to-end testing.
That's a whole other deep dive.
It is.
All right, well, we'll save that for another time then. It's been awesome exploring the world of API testing with you today. Hopefully our listener learned a ton and has some new things to explore. Thanks for joining us.